Since the official Eon Bond series began with Doctor No in October 1962, the series has hugely varied in terms of the style and tone. Doctor No has both elements of humour and grit without ever going too far in favour of one style. This is true of a lot of the early Connery outings, in particular his first three. However, the tone of the Bond series has certainly not remained stagnant since 1962 and has developed and evolved over the years. Doctor No was first released on October 5, 1962, and had a budget of around $1 million. Doctor No is considered to be a fairly loyal adaptation of the 1958 novel, not a 100% accurate adaptation for numerous reasons, one of which the ordering of the films is vastly different to that of the books. This means that some characters that appear in the novel are entirely absent from the film, with no mention. However, with that in mind, I think most Bond fans can agree that Doctor No works as an effective adaptation of the 1958 novel. Ian Fleming had envisioned the Bond world as fairly down-to-earth and realistic. Obviously, we all know that the Bond world isn't actually realistic at all. The life of the spy is likely far more boring and driven by paperwork than the films and books depict it to be. But that's not really the point here. In Doctor No, Bond investigates the actions of the mysterious and so far unseen Doctor No. Bond is independently minded, clever and resourceful. It's something that many people have forgotten, but Bond is a sharp character. This, in many ways, is how Fleming wrote Bond in the original novels. Tonally speaking, Doctor No, From Russia with Love and Goldfinger stick to a fairly grounded world. The humour at this stage in the franchise never went anywhere near off the chart and is far more subtle and understated. Humour is most certainly used, but far more sparingly. However, it's not like Connery's first three outings are dark and miserable affairs either. The films are tonally consistent and manage to strike a good balance between dark and silly. After the release of Goldfinger in 1964, the tone gradually starts to evolve with a greater emphasis on camp. This isn't immediately clear when watching Thunderball, but it is certainly seeping in. The somewhat grounded nature of the Bond films briefly ends with the release of 1967's You Only Live Twice. The film is probably one of the most iconic in the Bond franchise, with Donald Pleasence's Blofeld appearing, along with a well-remembered Spectre lair in the hollowed-out volcano. You Only Live Twice, despite the camp and the over-the-top nature of some of the scenes, is mostly a spy movie with elements of a light-hearted tone. Blofeld, for example, has an horrific facial scar. If this film was truly marketed as light and silly, Blofeld wouldn't have had any defining scars. The film isn't written as an outright comedy, but there is a far greater attempt this time round at cracking jokes. The double entendres and puns are very much a part of the Bond formula. However, here, whole scenes are now dedicated to making jokes. This, without a doubt, marked a clear change in the style and tone. During the production of You Only Live Twice, Sean Connery, having grown tired of the character, decided to leave the franchise once filming was complete. Sean Connery was replaced by George Lazenby, in one of the most baffling casting decisions in cinema history, but that is a video for another time. Unlike the previous film, On Her Majesty's Secret Service is a far closer adaptation to the novel, but for the purposes of this video, that's not really the point here. On Her Majesty's Secret Service spends little time on humour compared to the Connery outings. At the time, it was the most serious and grounded Bond film. There is a greater attempt here at creating genuine drama and suspense, rather than puns and double entendres. There's a reason why this film is regarded by many as peak James Bond, despite Lazenby's somewhat wooden performance. The film perfectly suited the time in which it was made and the world Fleming had created in those original novels. And to top it all off, Tracy DiVincenzo, or Tracy Bond, Bond's newly wedded wife, gets shot and killed right at the end of the movie. It's a quick death scene, and it's perfectly executed, no pun intended, and makes for a brilliantly harsh conclusion to the movie. Surely this sets up a revenge-style plot in the next film? Well, not quite. And when I say not quite, I mean not really at all. Instead of carrying on with this potential plot line, Diamonds Are Forever spends only its opening few minutes on it before ignoring the events of the previous film almost entirely. This may be down to the decidedly mixed response to On Her Majesty's Secret Service at the time, which would certainly also explain why the tone is totally different. Diamonds Are Forever began what many could call the camp era of Bond. Some of the humour genuinely works, but it's clear that that is the driving force behind many of the scenes. With Connery back for this one outing, it's slightly strange to see him as Bond, but in a jovial and over-the-top movie. With Live and Let Die, the first Bond movie to star Roger Moore, the campiness is still there, but it is toned down. This is the case for certainly the first three Moore films. The Man with the Golden Gun has a slightly darker edge than the other two, but that's only if you really want to be a bit pedantic. Moonraker was inspired by the success of 1977's Star Wars. The Spy Who Loved Me was initially supposed to be succeeded by For Your Eyes Only, as the credits led us to believe. However, this was changed in favour of Moonraker. Moonraker has almost nothing to do with the original novel, a further sign that the movie franchise was expanding beyond what Fleming wrote. The streak of silliness does come to a brief end with the release of 1981's For Your Eyes Only. Though not without its jokes, this particular Bond entry is much more serious and, while certainly not realistic, leans much more closely to the tone that Fleming had pictured. The camp and light-hearted tone returns with Octopussy, which came out 2 years later. However, the levels of camp and over-the-topness reached their absolute peak with the release of 1985's A View to a Kill. Without a doubt, the goofiest Bond film ever made. It practically becomes a spoof, and Roger Moore's visibly aged appearance since the last film didn't exactly help keep the film grounded. As mentioned in my video about the Dalton era, the tone became significantly darker, although that isn't quite so apparent with his first film, The Living Daylights. However, there is a hint of greater seriousness, and this comes through Dalton's sharp and captivating performance. Dalton's second and final film takes the darkness up to the max, resulting in possibly the most dramatic and brutal Bond movie to date, Licence to Kill. Licence to Kill features more violence than any preceding Bond movie, more blood when previous Bond characters came out fights unscathed, and more adult language, to put it mildly. Coming out just 4 years after A View to a Kill, this can make for a tonally jarring viewing experience, especially if you're binge-watching the Bond franchise. It's clear at this stage that the camp era of Bond was well and truly over. Licence to Kill has the Bond franchise at its most serious and grounded, and dare I say, somewhat realistic. It marked a huge change in the history of the Eon-produced Bond films. It was, without a doubt, a massive shift in style from the Moore years, in particular the later films. After a complicated and drawn-out 6-year hiatus, Bond finally returned, this time played by Pierce Brosnan in 1995's GoldenEye. The Brosnan years are neither dark and gritty like the Dalton years or jovial and light-hearted like the Moore years. There's a particular balance that was struck when making these films. Unlike the early Connery films, however, these films aren't trying to be Fleming books accurately translated to the big screen. Die Another Day is by a mile the silliest Brosnan movie. It doesn't quite reach the levels of A View to a Kill or even Diamonds Are Forever, but considering what the previous Brosnan films were like tonally, this feels like the odd one out. The film was released during the 40th anniversary of the Eon Bond series, and there's no room for subtle references here, no. The film basically spells out to the audience that this film is celebrating Bond with many references, just in case you didn't get it. The film on its own merits isn't that great either, and is by a whopping margin the weakest Brosnan Bond outing. At the time, the movie was considered a huge disappointment, especially by Bond fans. However, over time the film has become somewhat more appreciated, though it is still regarded as bad by most. The next film was Casino Royale, and it rebooted the franchise, which itself was a fairly big deal. The slate was wiped clean for the first time in over 40 years, and finally the most iconic Bond story would be adapted to the big screen by Eon Productions. Casino Royale takes Bond back to his roots. It may sound like a cliche to say that, but it's true. Bond needed taking down a peg, and I'm speaking for both the fictional character and the franchise. As if it needed saying, Casino Royale has a dark tone, but it's not like that's the main thing to mention. There is an actual story here, and the writers were justified in making Bond gritty and more down to earth. Gritty is an overused word, particularly in film discussion groups, but it's the best word I can use to describe Casino Royale. The darkness feels natural. It's not jarring watching this either because it's a reboot, and that allowed far more creative freedom, which was apparently one of the reasons why Eon opted for a reboot. With the Craig era so far, there is a greater consistency when it comes to the tone. Quantum of Solace is a train wreck of a movie. It's also a very bland and generic spy movie which lacks that special Bond feel. However, it does feel like it's at least set in the same universe as the previous film, so there's at least that. With Craig's first two outings, there's a massive dialing down when it comes to humour, and the violence seems much more brutal and genuine. That's one thing that perhaps I should mention. The stunt choreography was fairly good during the Brosnan years, was decent during the Dalton years, but was inconsistent and sometimes painfully obvious during the Moore years. During the Craig years so far, the stunts blend seamlessly into the action and are expertly directed. With that out of the way, let's move on. Skyfall was released 4 years after Quantum of Solace, and a number of improvements were made. For one, Skyfall abandoned the Quantum plotline that was started up in Casino Royale. Skyfall was also the 50th anniversary celebratory movie, so to make the movie fairly standalone made sense. Some time has also passed in-universe since the events of Quantum, so it also makes sense from this point of view. Skyfall includes more humour than Craig's previous two outings, while still keeping itself seeped in the grittier reboot world. The humour is brief when used, and are effectively small character moments that help keep the story grounded and not lose itself in a sea of bleakness. However, Skyfall is tonally coherent. It perfectly balances the grit with the humour and the drama with the comedy. It's why, among many reasons, it's considered to be one of the best films in the entire franchise. But make no mistake, Skyfall is dark. It's grounded and feels as realistic as Bond can get without descending into over-the-top melodrama. Spectre, however, almost returns to the Moore era. Well, not quite. Spectre puts a far greater emphasis on humour than any of Craig's previous Bond films. However, humour is now used during pivotal action scenes, for example the Aston Martin Jaguar chase scene in Rome. The drama of the situation is neglected in favour of a few quick jokes. It makes the scene frustrating to watch without the unnecessary additions of humour. It could have worked brilliantly. This is an issue many people have with Spectre. In many instances, the humour undercuts the drama. Some of the humour does work, yes, but in many cases the humour is unneeded and adds very little and only seems to take away. However, some scenes in Spectre are tense and feel consistent with the rebooted Craig Bond universe. It's why I consider Spectre to be at times a very tonally jarring movie, and especially so if you binge watch all of the Craig films together. As for No Time to Die, well, by the looks of things, it will bring back the kind of tone we saw in Craig's first three films. There isn't much I can say from an unreleased movie, but that's what I'm guessing from the trailer and the promo images. So, in conclusion, the Bond franchise has constantly evolved in one way or another since the release of Dr. No way back in 1962. The Craig era has clearly been the most grounded and dark yet, so what does this mean for the next Bond? Will the dark tone continue along with the colour palette, or will the franchise change tact and opt to return to what the Moore era did, or perhaps something in between? Whatever happens, Bond fans will be on tenterhooks on any possible Bond news story. The franchise has been going on since 1962, and despite the ups and downs, doesn't show any signs of slowing down.